Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. And please excuse my voice. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I'm excited to talk about today's topic, which is exploring loneliness across different life stages. The reason is, well, I've been feeling a bit lonely lately as an adult. And I think this is going to be a very interesting and relatable conversation for a lot of people, especially in this day and age where most of us are connected to one another through screens. So I will not let you wait any further, and I will introduce you to our lovely guest today, Dr. Andrea Mata, who is a clinical psychologist, and she specializes in the treatment of antisocial and aggressive behavior. We've got a bunch of questions lined up for her today on this topic, but I also know that she's very, passionate about different areas of clinical psychology. So I'll let her introduce herself a bit more. And I think she has a very cool nickname, Dr. Dre. We were laughing about that earlier. So I would love to get her to talk about that as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrea. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so I am Dr. Andrea Mata. My friends call me Dr. Dre because I have a PhD in clinical child psychology. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and now I'm living in Ohio. When I went to grad school went to Ohio for grad school, I always said, I'm getting out of Ohio as soon as I possibly can. And then I met my husband, who's third generation, Ohio guy. And I'm like, okay, now I'm here for life. But we just bought this beautiful home. So we have twin 6-year-olds and a 4-year-old who are doing their very best to be as quiet as they possibly can during the recording of this podcast. We'll see how that goes.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. It's funny how life treats you, huh? You're like, I gotta get out of here. And then life is like, nah, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah. I was like, I want to go back to Chicago. And then I was like, nope, just kidding. You're going to stay in Ohio forever.
Yeah, no, that's so good to hear. It's just funny how life works out sometimes. So yeah, I love that for you. And also, I was talking to you earlier about this. So, obviously when we invited you on board, we were so excited to have you on board. And I came across your TEDx talk as part of my research for this episode as well. And I have to say, it's not a lighthearted topic, but you made it to be something that I think was quite interesting to hear, and lots of people need to hear that. And as I said, it's not directly related to this topic per se, but would love for you to share a bit more about that with our audience so they know what that's about, and perhaps you can check out that TEDx talk too.
Yeah, so I had the goal. It was funny. I had the goal back in probably late 2022. I was told my husband, I'm like, I want to deliver a TED talk. And then a few weeks later, he was like, hey, the local state university is having a TEDx conference and they're looking for speakers. And so I talked to my friend, Eva Daniels, who's a speech coach, and she's like, apply for it. So we put together and we came up with this awesome title called From Murder to Mission, How I Found My Life's Calling or My Life's Mission, whatever. It's something along those lines. But the key phrase is From Murder to Mission. And so it's all about how when I was 11 years old, my brother was murdered, and how that set me along a path of leading up this mission to help children and families develop individual coping skills and relationship skills and parenting skills so that no one ever experiences what I had to experience when I was an 11-year-old.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I think, as I said earlier, it's not an easy topic to kind of talk about or even digest. But for you to bravely walk onto a station and talked about it and share it with people, I think first of all it was brave. Second of all, it was admirable because it must have been really hard for you to get through that. It's you are so young and this happened, and obviously today's topic is not about that, but I want to take a moment to sort of let our audience think about that particular topic, because a lot of people might be going through the same thing or similar things that they don't know how to process. But from murder to mission is kind of like a really interesting phrase to hear. First of all, like it's not a fun topic, obviously, but the phrase was so interesting to me. I was like, huh, that's interesting. Okay, I gotta listen to this now, and I was actually playing it here in the studio, and I was like, got my colleagues to listen to it as well. It's quite, yeah, it was quite a good TEDx talk, because I love TED Talks and I listened to a lot of them, and I have to say that was a really good one. So thank you for doing that and for sharing that with us as well.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that a lot of people experience. I remember it was my sophomore year in college, and I went to a Lutheran-based university, Valparaiso University, and I remember sitting in this theology class that was required, and our professor looked, and he would looked around the room, and he was like, "Hey, how many of you guys are strongly for the death penalty?" And this isn't about the death penalty; it's just a story. But so a few people raised their hand, and then he's like, "Okay, well, how many of you guys are strongly for the death penalty?" And I was the only one that raised my hand. And he was like, what's that about? And I was like, well, my brother was murdered when I was 11 years old. And he was like, whoa. He's like, I have never come into contact with anyone who's experienced murder within their family. And I'm like, well, I don't really wish it on anybody. I'm grateful. I mean, I'm grateful for what it has given me and the path that it has put me on, because I will never be purposeless. That is for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think from what I know, a lot of people, especially in the United States, have gone through this. Especially in the past, I don't know, decade or 2 decades. Lots of people have had people that are murdered. In their family, and it's obviously really sad. But I think that's why your TEDx talk is particularly relevant in this day and time. And it's a whole other topic in itself that perhaps we can discuss in another podcast. And I think it is an important thing to talk about because the population that experience this is probably way smaller than, for example, the population that experiences loneliness. But because it's so small, not a lot of people talk about it. And so it's even more important to talk about it. So yeah, we probably will dedicate a whole other podcast to talk about that. But let's get back to today's topic and talk about you, first of all. So let's get to know you a bit better. We have this part we call Have You Met Andrea? And I should have changed it to Have You Met Dr. Dre?
I just had to save that in my head.
Yeah, should have done that. Too late. But yeah, I slipped that in, so that's good. So we're going to get you to share a few things that you love with us so that we get to know you a bit better. I find this to be very interesting. And in fact, I kind of like to use these prompts to ask new friends as well, to get to know them better. So, first question, what is your favorite book?
My favorite book is To Kill, Time to Kill. So that, I mean, it's just, I remember it was one that I had to read, I believe my senior year of high school, and it was just one that I could not put down. And then I enjoyed the movie as well. And so that's my favorite go-to book. Now, if I need something a little bit more lighthearted, I'm probably going to go to the Harry Potter series or Hunger Games or something like that. That's much more easy read and doesn't just kind of sit in your gut as much.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I'm a Potterhead, so I love it whenever anyone mentions Harry Potter. But the Hunger Games, that's not really a light read in my opinion, because I remember reading the Hunger Games trilogy and I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. Not that fun.
Yes. Yeah. It's not that fun, but it's I think it's a little bit easier than like A Time to Kill. But then the
Yeah.
new movie is coming out, I think in November. So I'm pretty excited about that one.
Oh, what's the new movie?
Oh, well, did you read the book? It was where like it's featuring like was it President Snow when he was younger? It's like ballads of songs and snakes or
Nah,
something. And
I
so
haven't.
it's really good. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend. It came out a few years
Oh,
ago. And so it's
okay.
all about like President Snow when he was younger,
Oh,
before like
wow.
when he was like one of the managers in the Hunger Games. And so that movie is coming out, I think, later this year.
Oh, very timely. Thank you for your recommendation. I'll have to look into that. Do you remember the title of the book by any chance?
I want to say it's Ballads of Songbirds. I think if you literally just put in like Hunger Games Ballads of Songbirds, it will pop up.
Okay. Oh, yes. I see it. Oh, yeah. The film is coming out this year. That is correct. Oh, wow. Okay. New thing today. I had no idea that existed. Okay.
It's so good. Yeah.
Okay. Right. All right. Very interesting. Okay. I learned something new today. Thank you for that. Before we digress, the next question is actually about a movie. What would be your all-time favorite movie?
My all-time favorite movie is Remember the Titans. So just like that high school football, American football movie that is just like pulls at your heartstrings like warm and fuzzy. And I also do some performance coaching for a high school football team. So it kind of always brings me back to those Friday nights where I spend with high school football boys that really stink, but I love them.
I love that. Well, thank you for sharing that. Really good insights. Next question is about a podcast. Now, a lot of our guests actually don't listen to podcasts. I wonder if you do. And if you do, what would be your favorite one?
I really I don't know if you've heard of this one. Well, I mean, I have my own, so I should probably plug my own, like the BrightSpot podcast. But if I have to go to one outside of my own, I go to the Justin Brady show. He has some pretty big names on, and he asks very insightful questions. I don't know if there's another better interviewer out there compared to Justin.
Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing both of those, and especially for sharing yours. I didn't know you had a podcast, so I learned that today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did. It kind of like did a little bit of a transition. So like the first few episodes are very like cognitive psychology in nature. And then my co-host actually went and became a mom. How rude, right? Like she went and became a mom. And then, so then I wanted to give her some time to be a mom and respect those things. And then so then I started bringing in people that I thought had pretty amazing stories and were doing some awesome things. And so I'd bring them in and interview them. But I've since kind of put that on hold as I start writing or kind of finish up this book that I'm writing that I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about that later. Love that. Well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, now, next one. This is my favorite question recently because I learned about a lot of new people. So who is your role model if you have one?
I do have a role model. So my go-to role model is actually my father. So if you listen to my TEDx talk, you'll hear about him. So the big thing with him is that he migrated to the States from Mexico, didn't have not a whole lot of money in his pocket. He just wanted to come here to, seek out opportunities, the American dream. He met my mom. They actually lived next door to each other. What are the odds? And they fell in love and they had 4 kids, me. But yeah, and so his work ethic is impeccable, and he really instilled that like strong work ethic in us of like nothing will ever be given to you. You have to work for everything in this life. And so like that like anti-entitlement. I don't know if you guys are experiencing over there in Australia, but like in the States right now, it's prevalent, like with our youth being super entitled. And so a lot of the time I just want to look at them and be like, nothing will ever be handed to you. Like you have to work for everything. And you don't deserve deserve. I get triggered by that word deserve.
Oh, yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting perspective there because, I mean, for me, I think the word entitled can also be triggering for a lot of people. Like, I have been told once, a very long time ago, you millennials are so entitled. And I was so shocked because a millennial was telling me that. And I was kind of like, I was kind of taken aback. But I love that you brought this perspective because I do agree that, you know, like we have to work for things that we want, and, you know, you have to earn it. It's not, nothing gets served to you. And that is so true. I mean, a lot of people have easier lives than others, you know, growing up perhaps. But I think it's just perspective. Like it's what you want to see out of that situation. Which is a whole other topic in itself, and I can talk about this a lot. But I love that you brought your father as a figure for that particular context, because I think for me it's probably my mom, you know, who might be similar in that sense, and I think we should all, you know, teach kids that perspective, because life right now would probably be way easier than they were 10, 20 years ago, and definitely easier than wartime. And for that, it you know, they might be a bit more entitled in some senses. I don't know. I think it is a matter of discussion for a lot of people, because some might still say, I still have my struggle, you know, like mental health issues are at an all-time high nowadays. So are we entitled? We don't know, right? It's such a can of worm to open, to be honest. Yeah, yeah, but yeah, I do love that topic, especially because this podcast is about happiness, and that topic is a very big one when you think about happiness. But we digress once more. Now, last question in this part: what is a course you've completed, as in you've taken, that left a really strong impact on you?
I think the biggest one for me looking back was probably my cognitive psychology class in my undergrad. And so it was like the first time in my life, so I took it my senior year, where like I had to like struggle with the material. Like usually psychology stuff just kind of came naturally to me and it was easy. But with this cognitive psychology and how it was taught, it was like, I remember having to like work with it and like work on it. And there was like, I had 3 of my friends who were all seniors taking the class with me. And I remember it was like the time where we would like, all the 4 of us would get together and we would study for hours for these exams. And then like we would, you know, get high B's or low A's or whatever. And we were like, okay, like I got an A- in that class. And I was like, I'm completely okay with that A-.
A minus. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm just laughing at that. Yeah, that's tough. That's really tough. No, but that's good to hear, that, you know, there's a class that is like particularly challenging, but it left a strong impact on you, because, you know, sometimes we kind of think about different materials that we study, and I think, you know, knowing what we like is when materials come to us easily, but also when things come to us a little bit more challenging and it gets us to think, is also the space to grow, right? So, you know, it's kind of like that balance, and it's really nice to hear. I love psychology. I've been, you know, learning a bit more about it recently, so that's really fun to hear from your perspective. And we've got to know you heaps better now, you know, thanks to that part. So thank you for being very open and honest about the questions of, have you met Andrea? Oh, sorry, have you met Dr. Dre? Now, let's talk about today's topic. You know, we're here to talk about loneliness across different life stages. We're here to talk about happiness. I think some of our audience might wonder, you know, why are you talking about loneliness when you're talking about happiness? So let's talk about happiness first to set the scene for this conversation. There is a correlation there, I'm sure, and we can get into that very soon. First of all, I would love to hear your perspective on happiness itself. It's a very big word. It gets thrown around pretty much every day. Each person has their own definition of happiness. So what is it to you?
Happiness to me is, I go super psychological, and it's like happiness is a fleeting emotion that like is not meant to we're not meant to be happy all of the time. And so like, I'm like, when I hear people being like, I just want to be happy. And I'm like, I get that you want to like experience happy, but like what I think a lot of the time people don't realize is that our bodies aren't meant to be happy all of the time, because that's exhausting for our bodies. And like, we're actually meant to be content. So to me, like happiness and like, yes, I'll have those fleeting moments where like everything is just going right, or my kids are doing something really, goofy and silly or endearing that I just absolutely love, and I'm satisfied with my life. But then like those last for a little while, and then you just kind of go back to, being content. And so that's one thing when I see clients, and a lot of like college students coming in right now, they're like, well, I'm not happy. And I'm like, well, what's your expectation for how often you're supposed to be happy? And then I do like this teaching where it's like, okay, there's these 5 different levels of mood, and like happiness is at the top. And like, yes, you should be feeling happy occasionally, but at the vast majority of the time, you should be experiencing this like mid-level called euthymia or contentment, where you're just like, okay, like life is good. And so that's my very psychological, nerdy way of saying my definition of happiness.
Yeah, I love it. I love a psychological definition of happiness. And I think we've talked about it quite a few times on the show. Obviously, it's not something that is there all the time. Happiness, it sounds like these great things that everyone should have. But in fact, most of the time, what you're feeling in a particular moment is not happiness. I think if anyone has a graph of their emotion and most of the time they're happy, I'm just going to be like, I want to study that brain and your life and everything else that is associated with it, because that is interesting. I think, more often than not, even if we're in a good state of mind, we probably feel things like peaceful, tranquil, like, I don't know, lots of other sort of emotions or states that we feel, not necessarily happy. And that's totally okay. And I've learned that as well, because I think growing up, a lot of people sort of like place this strong emphasis on you gotta be happy. And then it kind of stuck with me. Oh, I should be happy? Not really, because most of the time I'm actually not that happy.
And then, yeah, and I think like we as a society, we're like, well, you should be happy, and it's like, well, why are you just telling me like I should be happy? Like I should be content. Like that's what I want to be. That's what I strive for a lot of my clients to kind of accept and understand and move forward with.
Definitely. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions I think people have about happiness, which you just addressed. Now, I wonder if you have noticed any other misconceptions people have about happiness.
I think the other big misconception is people think that material items are going to make them happy. So like if I just get this newer phone, that will make me happy. If I just get this better car, it will make me happy. If I just get this or this or this. And like we've put a lot of like emphasis of like, oh, we're going to be super happy like if we get this newer, better, bigger thing. But what people don't realize is that, like, again, happiness is fleeting in that. So you're going to think this new phone is like super awesome. And then come a few weeks later, like, it's just going to be your phone. It's not going to be even like the new phone. It's funny. I was working with a teenager the other day and she had just gotten a new phone and she was super excited and she wanted to spend a bunch of her therapy session on it. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, like, we've had this conversation before where it's like, it's shiny, it's new, but then in a few weeks, it's just going to be your phone. So I think that's another big misconception that people have, that they think that things are going to give them or make them happy. And it's not necessarily the case.
Oh, yeah. I can hear, like, I totally agree with that because I'm one of those people. I used to be one of those people that just hoard a lot of stuff to fill in my, like the gaps in here, whatever that might be, which might be related to this topic, actually. And I will probably preface by saying I'm not representing all people, But in the pandemic, I started shopping a lot. And that was probably because I was excited. I was living by myself for the first time ever, in my adult life. So that was exciting. So I bought a lot of household items, which was fine. But then I started to buy a lot of things I didn't need. And I think that was to fill the gap of loneliness. And also, so it's like stuff happened during that time as well. But I think that was why I got stuff, not just to feel happy, but to fill the gap of, oh, I feel lonely.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the time, like when we get things, we get that dopamine hit, right? And so then we feel good. And like if we are lonely and we're in the middle of a pandemic, well, like, how do you not feel lonely? Well, you have to connect. Like connection is protection, but like you can't because we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're in the middle of lockdowns. And so it's like, okay, well, if I buy this thing, I'll get this, and people aren't like actually thinking about this. I mean, maybe they are, but like if I buy this thing, it will make me feel better. And I think people were just trying to chase ways to feel better. And I'm going to hold that against them? Absolutely not. Because especially for people who were like, not around families during that time. And I always talk about it. I haven't done research on it because I'm not in an academic setting anymore. But I always talked about one of the big things that I noticed with the pandemic is that we talk about like the widening wage gap, right? Mm-hmm. I think what happened during the pandemic is that we saw a widening of like family functioning. So like families that were doing really well, that are able to communicate, that they have good relationships, they, spend quality time together and are good being together. I think they got stronger during the pandemic because in all of the lockdowns. And then I think the families or the couples who were struggling, they had poor communication. They didn't want to be around each other. They couldn't, spend quality time together without getting into fights and those kind of things. I think those families got worse during the pandemic. And so then you saw like this widening gap of like how families were functioning because of the pandemic, because we were forced to spend so much time together.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely interesting because it varied from family to family and people, person to person. Lots of people like myself were living alone. And on the other hand, a lot of people were just with their family 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
And two completely different experiences.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like you have the idea of oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, all right, that gives me perspective because then now it's like is it maybe opposite, maybe not really opposite of loneliness? Because I was thinking, like a lot of people might still be experiencing loneliness even though they had people surrounding them all the time, 24/7 during a pandemic. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, because they didn't feel connected, and they didn't know how to like repair it. And then it was like, okay, well, how we don't know, we don't have the skills, like we don't know what we're doing, like, and the world is falling apart around us.
Yeah. That's an interesting clue you just gave me there for our conversation today, because obviously we're talking about loneliness and a lot of people might mistake that for being alone. It's kind of not, like, at least from what I've learned, and this might be from a psychological perspective as well, but a lot of people talk about this, right? And it's just like a learning curve for all of us. Growing up, we kind of start to notice the difference between feeling lonely versus being alone. Those are two quite different things. And you mentioned the keyword connection. And I guess this has to tie into how we experience loneliness across the life stages. Because I think people all have experienced loneliness at one point or another in their lives. So I think we don't necessarily need to go and define it. But I guess we probably would want to understand how it varies. And this is a good learning curve for young people and old people alike, right? How do we experience loneliness across these life stages? Why does it happen? Does it have to do with connection? And what does it mean for our happiness?
Yeah, and so the vast majority of the research that I've done on loneliness, and it's so funny to talk about loneliness now in 2023 because the paper that I published that I was a co-author on loneliness was published back in like 2013. So like we were talking about loneliness back in like 2010, 2011, 2012. The paper finally got published in 2013. And what we were looking at how children from the ages of from third grade, so like about 9 years old to 15 years of age, experience loneliness. And we were looking to see, okay, is this a universal thing that everyone is going to consistently experience high levels of loneliness, or are there going to be some, differences? And what we actually found was that there was 5 different trajectories of loneliness from 9 years old to 15 years old. And so you had the people that were almost half of the youth in the sample that we used didn't experience pretty low levels of loneliness. It's not that they never experienced loneliness, because I think you were right, Lou. Like everyone experiences loneliness sometime in their life. And then we had this interesting group that experienced pretty high levels when they were 9, and then they significantly decreased from when they were, they were 11 years old, and then when they were 15 years old. And then you had this group that were like the chronic ones. So about 4% of the sample were in the chronic trajectory, where they consistently had high levels of loneliness. And then you had these 2 groups that increased their loneliness across, from middle childhood or late childhood all the way to, middle adolescence. And so like you had these different trajectories, and we found that different things predicted the, memberships in the different groups. And so I think people experience loneliness differently. Are we experiencing more loneliness now due to the pandemic than we did when we, did this research? I think absolutely. I think one of the interesting things is, I know the CDC has been like talking a lot about it, is the loneliness has as bad of physical and mental health outcomes as like if you smoked 15 cigarettes a day, which is just like bananas to me, thinking that like smoking 15 cigarettes a day has a similar outcomes as like what just not being connected with someone and feeling like you don't belong anywhere.
Yeah. I paused there for a second because I was just thinking about cigarettes when you said that. And, I think a lot of people actually smoke cigarettes because they are lonely.
Mm-hmm.
So on top of the 15 cigarettes that are not actually consumed by them, they add more cigarettes on top of that because of that feeling. How mind-blowing is that?
The anxiety. Yeah. That the anxiety that comes with like socializing. Because I think right now, one of the things that the pandemic did, and like when I start talking about this with our youth, is like the pandemic, it's like, hey, let's take all of our youth or all of our people and like isolate them for 18, in the States, it was like about 18 months to 2 years. And it's like that wreaked havoc on our mental health and our loneliness. And it also like, it's like they lack social skills. And I mean, that's something that we had found in the paper back a while ago, but like this ability to like just have spontaneous conversations and be able to carry on a conversation and not be, experience such high levels of social anxiety because they were only interacting with their family for, 18 months to 24 months.
Yeah, well, that is certainly something to think about, I know that we also have sort of got out of the pandemic, but I think, reflecting back on that time and seeing how it's still affecting us nowadays is certainly crucial when you try to understand loneliness even better, because I think during that time we had the sample size for research as in the whole global population. It's not like a small group that was experiencing it. And I think that's why we can all talk about it from different perspectives. But what I do know is like you were saying, right? Like the mental health and physical impact it had on our body would be similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, if I remember that number correctly. And when we're talking about our happiness, obviously it is a state It is not something that is static. It's not something that you feel all the time. But certainly, it affects our happiness level to a certain extent. And I think the interesting question here would probably be, how does it vary from person to person? Because I think that the level of loneliness is probably not universal. Like if I'm saying to you, oh, I feel a little bit lonely, it might not be like I'm feeling lonely all the time. It might be like just a fleeting feeling of this particular moment. Or maybe this week I'm feeling lonely because I haven't talked to my friends as much. Or maybe I'm self isolating. But then for other people, it's kind of like a prolonged situation where they feel lonely in their own circles, in their own family. They feel, disconnected from everything. And I think it might be another factor for depression. Like I kind of like read up on this a little bit more. So yeah, I wonder how it varies actually, from person to person, and how do we know when it's actually at a dangerous like all-time high and we need to do something about it?
Yeah, I think when I used to teach, one of the things that I would do is when we would talk about like depression and suicide and suicidal ideation, because your loneliness score, impacts or is correlated with suicidal ideation. So higher levels of loneliness are associated with like you thinking about taking your own life, more often than not. And so and what we would do a lot of the time is we would give them a loneliness scale. And so the one that I would typically give out to my students is like the UCLA loneliness scale. And I can't remember if there was I don't think there was a cutoff or like a threshold where it's like, if you are scoring this score, then like you need to, you should seek out clinical help or some kind of support or something along those lines. But I would say like for different people, some people aren't going to be bothered by, they might have high levels of loneliness, but they're not necessarily bothered by it. And other people they're going to have lower scores, but then they would be really, really bothered by it. And so I think it really just kind of depends on that individual person and people having the self-awareness to know, okay, where do you fall in that? Are you someone who, okay, I'm experiencing a moderate level of loneliness for myself, but for the most part, like I'm okay. I can make these small adjustments and then I can turn it around. Or are you the person that can, experiences, what would be considered a lower level, but like it has, detrimental effects. And so I think it's kind of understanding yourself and where you're at in regards to loneliness, and then seeking out what you can do to kind of help you with that loneliness. Because I don't think any level of I shouldn't say that, but like I think like something about loneliness, like we can do something about it. Like we can be agents in our lives. If you're noticing that you're lonely, I would rather you like go out and do something about it than just sit kind of back and be like, I'm lonely. Someone come save me.
I think that's a really good point, because it's quite hard sometimes to feel the connection and to help with that loneliness. And I think part of that, and I don't know if the research shows this, but for me, part of that is I'm disconnected from myself in the first place. It's not, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not connecting to others. Some weeks I feel like, oh yeah, like I'm, connecting to friends, like having great conversations and hang out. And then I'm still left with that hollow feeling, not because I'm not connecting with others, but I'm not connecting to myself.
Right. Yeah. And so a lot of the time I'll talk about, like when I talk about like, I gave this talk just a few days ago. I call it like the fundamentals of mental health. So I talk about like sleep and food and rejuvenation and movement. And the last of the 5 of the fundamentals is connection. So like making yourself feel, or like putting yourself out there to feel like you're connected with other people, to try to, ward off that loneliness, ward off the depression, ward off anxiety, all of those things.
Yeah, that's certainly a really good one to think about. Now, I think one thing that we sort of briefly touched on earlier in the conversation, which we haven't gone into much more detail, but it's kind of important though, is this, new age of technology, kind of similar to the teenager you were working with and her new phone. Technology and social media have become so prevalent nowadays. It's just everywhere and everyone is using it. And I was talking to a guest on the show the other day, and I was kind of saying, I find it weird that my friends start conversation on Instagram DMs nowadays. Like, I prefer a text, at least. Like, it's just like it's weird to navigate through this whole space, and I feel like that has something to do with loneliness. And it's not about people being on social media or using technology per se, but it's kind of like the personal behaviors, like how you behave when you're on such platforms. For example, like I find that this is just a personal observation. Years ago, when this was a new thing, I found myself scrolling for hours, and it was like addictive. I don't do that anymore, but I look back on that time and I was like, why did I do that? And I spent hours of my time scrolling, looking at other people's lives, having fun doing that somehow. But I didn't really, I didn't really feel any sense of, for example, connection, which is the word that you just used earlier to talk about how we can combat, loneliness and, other mental health issues. So how does this work? Because I'm sure there must be new research findings about this area. A lot of people are doing this now, right? A lot of people are talking about scrolling for fun or doom scrolling when they don't know what else to do. And that definitely affects loneliness.
Yes. And so I think I struggle because, like, as you talked about, like, oh, your friends are, starting up conversations on Instagram. It's like, yeah, working with youth. Like, I have this young, like, middle, like, tween, I'll call them. And she's like, well, I have to get Snapchat. And I'm like, why do you have to get Snapchat? And she's like, because that's how all my friends like message each other. And I was like, just text message each other. And she's like, no, we don't like text message. We like message on Snapchat. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, and so I think more and more research is coming out. And it's showing that the more time that you spend on social media, the more likely you are to experience loneliness and depression and anxiety, just because you're experiencing this FOMO. Or like, I know, like, for me, when I see like some of my friends and they're out and they're doing something together, and I'm like, they didn't invite me. And then that loneliness comes in. And you're like, hey, like, what is going on or something like that. And so, like, my best friend, she had a party that she invited me to a few weeks ago. And she's like, oh, all my favorites. And I like texted her, like, just being, banter back. And I was like, your favorites? And she's like, you know what I mean. And I'm like, I know, but still. And so I think with the scrolling and the doom scrolling, it's like, I tell my clients a lot of the time, it's like, so scroll through whatever social media you want to, but before you do that, kind of check in with your mood. Are you like a 1, a 2, a 3, 4, or 5 level mood? 3 being that euthymic, that contentment kind of stage. Check in where your mood is. If at the end of you scrolling through social media, if your mood is not at least the same as it was before you started scrolling, then that activity is not doing you any favors. So like, if your mood has gone down from your scrolling on social media, then that's not an activity that's building you up. It's one that could possibly be hurting you. And would you be better served? Would your mental health be better served by going and doing something else, trying something else that could possibly elevate your mood? Clinical psychologists call this behavioral activation. It's one of the most empirically supported treatments for depression. It's like, do more activities that boost your mood and try to reduce the activities that, kind of tank your mood.
Yeah, definitely. I think the whole time you were talking about that, like I have this like film that was playing in my head, with like all the stuff that I've seen on social media and like all the time that I've engaged with it. And I'm kind of like, yeah, that's so true. Like if I switch that off, do something else, even, still same phone, right? I can do a lot of things on my phone and again, do something else. I can't even read on my phone nowadays. How great is that? Kindle's on your phone. So, like even just like an act of changing how we're using and interacting with this space is great. And actually, I also have to say, scrolling is not great for when you're trying to not feel lonely or, it might exacerbate loneliness. But I do have to say, if you're actively controlling how you're engaging, it's also great because what I have found is, because I told you I've been really into psychology, right? What I have started doing is I have a TikTok account, which I don't use very often, but when I do, I search for psychology videos and all these psychologists come up on my feed and I listen to their contents and it's kind of like bite size and it's kind of to the topic. And I'm like, this is good. Actually, like I'm actively looking for what I want to consume. And once I'm done, I'm done. So that's fun. And it's not like, oh, like I'm just going with the flow and like scrolling through whatever they're presenting to me. I'm not.
Right. I think that's another good point, Lou. Like, if you are going to scroll, one of the other things not to kind of be sucked in to social media and have it like tank your mood is have a purpose. Like, what are you searching for? Are you searching for something specific? Like right now, I've been doing a lot of like on Instagram, like hair tutorials where like I saw this one and it just kind of popped it up and I'm like, oh, I could totally do that with my hair. Like, all right, like, oh, okay, do that little thing. And so now the algo is just like feeding me more and more hair tutorials, but it's okay because it's not making me feel worse about myself.
Yeah,
and I can like maybe figure out some cute ways to do my girl's hair.
Yeah, that's great. It's kind of like me and my Instagram feed full of cats, like it's great. Like I just actively search for cat videos and more cat videos get feeded into my content. I'm like, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great. It helps with loneliness as well. Yeah, like I think we should all at least try to actively search for something rather than just let it control us, because I think we can take back our control, right? We can be our own agents, just like you were saying earlier. And that's one of the ways that we can control how we interact with platforms like social media and beyond. Like what you search for is, like what you want to nourish your minds with. So there you go.
Right. And I think the other big thing is like research is coming out recently that's showing that like TikTok. So like I've had quite a few clients come in and they're like, I think I have ADHD. And I'm like, why do you have ADHD? Like, why do you think you have ADHD? And they're like, TikTok told me so. And I'm like, let me describe the algo to you. Like, if you pause on like an ADHD video for too long, it's just going to feed you more ADHD videos. And then you're going to experience this thing called medical student syndrome where you're like, yes, I do that. And I do that. And I do that. And I do that. And I'm like, no, like you don't like, and I gave them the neuropsychological assessments and none of them had ADHD. Who TikTok told them they did. And then more research is coming out that is showing like, I think it was 87% of TikTok videos that have something to do with psychological disorders actually have false information in them. And like 100% of like the ADHD videos that they looked at had false information, 100% of them.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. Yeah, because I have been learning more about ADHD this year, interestingly enough. Not because of Instagram or TikTok, because of somebody somebody I know who has it, and they were like, "Oh, you should learn about this." I'm like, "Okay, cool." I had no idea what it was about, but it's so interesting when you're saying that most of these videos have false information. So that's another thing to think about. You don't want to consume contents that are not going to be of service. So I think that's why searching for contents by psychologists would be much better. But we digress. Now let's get back to loneliness. It's so great to talk about these things, right? It's just kind of like, it's like social media. It sucks you right in. You cannot get out. But the last part I want to discuss with you on this topic is the fact that it's so hard to talk about it. Today you and I, we're here on this line. We're talking about loneliness because we're here to talk about it. But guess what? I don't think people talk about this very often. And I don't think I've heard a conversation where people are kind of like, let's talk about loneliness. And in fact, I can tell you something. I like to be open and honest when I talk to my friends, but I'm only open and honest when I'm with people that I trust. And I remember talking to my group of friends, and I said to them, because I've been living by myself for 3 years at that point. And, like everyone was just like talking about how life was going. And I was kind of like, life's good, but sometimes I do feel that sense of loneliness because I moved countries. I don't have a support system here. I don't have my family here. I don't have my closest friends, like my childhood friends here. And you guys are my closest friends. And I appreciate you all, but we all have different lives. And, sometimes I just feel lonely. Like I don't feel connected to people like I used to anymore. And then it went silent. Like no one knew what to say. And I was like, oh, yeah. I was like, oh, okay, now I know I shouldn't bring this topic up with these people then. It's fine to know. But it was a moment where I was kind of like, oh, sad. Cannot talk to them about this. Maybe they don't relate, or maybe they don't know how to respond. So I guess in a way, it is still kind of a taboo topic. It is a topic that is hard to talk about. Not a lot of people talk about it. My best friend and I talk about it quite often. So that's different. And I appreciate that we can talk about it. But, with the larger population, I have found that it's hard to talk to a lot of people about this because they don't know how to respond. Maybe they haven't experienced it. I don't know. Or maybe they just don't know what to say.
I would guess that they've experienced it, but like, I'm trying to think about it in my head because I doubt that they haven't experienced loneliness. I think everyone has experienced loneliness sometime in their life, but maybe it's they don't know how to talk about it, or like, is it a thing where it's like, it's the thing that shall not be named because if we name it, then like it gets bigger, like Voldemort. I don't know.
He who shall not be named.
Exactly. Like, do not talk about loneliness because if you talk about loneliness, then it comes into your life. Like, no, I think I just think it makes people super uncomfortable because then maybe it's people then think it's about they make it about them, and then they start to question. I'm just trying to think of like what you experienced. Then did they start to maybe question like they weren't good friends, like you didn't see them as good friends, or they weren't being good friends because you felt lonely, so they weren't like meeting your needs? Like, I don't know. That's super interesting. But I don't I mean, I've talked about loneliness, but like I'm also a clinical psychologist, so like who has researched it in the past. But it's not like something like I'm going to go to like a dinner party and be like, hey, so let's talk about loneliness. When was the last time you felt lonely? Like, I don't.
Yeah, definitely not. I think it's the question here is probably not how do we talk about it more, but probably how do we hold space for such conversations? Because we don't really need to encourage people to talk about it as much. If they don't want to talk about it, I don't think we need to kind of like, like force them into uncomfortable, situations where like, when was the last time you were lonely? Huh? Talk about it now. Tell me. It's not like that. It's more like, how do we hold space for people to talk about it when it's safe to do so? Because I felt rejected when no one said anything, when I opened up and talk about it. And I also understand the other perspective because I now live with my best friend, and she did talk to me the other day, and she said, I've been feeling really lonely. And I was kind of joking to her. I was like, well, so what about me? I'm right here. And she's like, I know. We was like joking about it because we both understand what it feels like. You can be with someone and still feel lonely. Totally normal. And I'm glad we could talk about it. And yeah, perhaps people were probably a little bit offended, but I think loneliness is not something to take personally. So I think it's important to learn to hold space for people when we need to talk about this. You don't have to kind of like dig that information out of someone. Like, are you lonely? Tell me. It's not. It's more like, okay, so if and when someone brings this up, how do we deal with the conversation in a way that would, help them? And perhaps we can talk about, understanding strategies, like anything that you might find helpful. I think that would be helpful for our audience.
I think the big thing is, and I was just thinking about this, I think the big thing is like when you are experiencing loneliness, maybe the first thing before like going out and like telling, trusted confidants or your best friends or people, loved ones, those that you trust, that you're lonely, I think the first thing is to maybe be more introspective and be like, okay, what is it that's causing me to be lonely? Because like we all know you can be in a room of 100 people and feel lonely. And so what is it? What need are you not getting? What need of yours is not being met that's leading to the loneliness? Like if if you do have a significant other and you live with that significant other, okay, what is it? Is there something about the relationship that's going on that's causing you to feel lonely? That I think once you can kind of unpack that and like, can you figure out what's causing you to be lonely? Then can you approach someone and be like, okay, this is what I need. Like, I need you to do this. And then maybe let's run an experiment and see whether or not that will reduce my loneliness. Does that like, yeah, maybe that? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is holding space, right? It's just another way to hold space for that particular person or whoever you're talking to about that topic. Because I think a lot of the times we have this tendency of like we try to help, and then by trying to help, we're not really helping. So, I think that's a really good way to try to help, because we're not assuming anything. We're allowing them to think for themselves. And perhaps we can be, the extra pair of hands or the extra brain that to help with them with the thinking process. And I think to have a safe space where people can talk about it in the first place is already great. So baby steps.
Yeah, and I think like if someone were to come to you and say like I'm lonely, and similar to like if I went to my husband and I went to my husband and I was like, hey, I'm feeling lonely, I would hope that he wouldn't like automatically jump to being offended of like he's doing something wrong, but to give me that space to have those conversations of like, okay, what can we do to try to reduce your loneliness? And so like if someone goes to you and says like, hey, I'm lonely, don't make it about you, like, and be like, oh, I don't understand how you could possibly be lonely. Like, I'm next to you every single time. Like, I'm holding your hand and all of these things. But like, pause and, simply just say like, tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect start. Really, I think it's just important to educate our audience about it, because whoever is clicking onto this episode, they either want to be heard or they want to hear somebody out when it comes to loneliness. So hopefully this helps. Now, it's been a lot of theoretical things that we've taken into account. So let's get a little bit more practical with our practice part. And I would love to know, what is a practice that you use personally to address loneliness? Or maybe a practice that you find would be probably helpful to most people.
Yeah. So when that talk on what I do, like the fundamentals of mental health, and I give practical tips and tools for connection, there's 4 things that I always talk about. I talk about one of the biggest things that I have been forcing myself to do because I'm an introvert. One of the things that I've been forcing myself to do this year is networking. And so like going out and like looking for those networking opportunities that are in person. I don't think we need more screen time, but going out in those networking opportunities and putting yourself out there. and seeing what comes of it. So I think that's one tip. So like one thing that I've been doing, there's this great networking group that I'm a part of, and they meet the first Wednesday of every month. And so like I force myself, regardless of how I'm feeling, of whether or not I really want to do it, other than like when I'm sick. I missed last week because I was sick. And I'm not going to like spread germs anywhere. That's a bad idea. But like going and putting yourself out there and like asking, like, and people are like, I hate networking opportunities because I don't know like what to say. One of the two phrases that I've gotten from my colleague or friend Ross is he's like, ask like what's keeping them busy or what they're excited about. Like those are two questions in those networking events, like what's keeping them busy and what are they excited about. And that can like, it's above and beyond like, what's your name? What career do you do? Well, like stuff that's like, it's a little bit more like personal and it's getting a little bit more relationship building in there. So I think that's one thing. I think the other big thing is we need to put this down. Like when you are, you know, out at the grocery store, when you're walking around, have your phone away and talk to strangers. And I know that's like super scary and like, you know, stranger danger has been instilled in us and all of those things. But I really find value in like talking and carrying on conversations and like regaining that ability to have spontaneous conversations with people. So putting down our phones and talking to strangers, I think is great. I could literally write a book on like random things that strangers have come up to me and like told me. I just have that face. I remember there was this guy and I was in a McDonald's, like inside of a McDonald's, and this guy just like walked up to me and he's like, hey. I'm like, hi. And then he starts talking to me about like how he's thinking about, and he didn't know who I was. Like, I don't wear a shirt that says like I'm a psychologist or anything like that. But he like came up to me and started talking to me about how like he's thinking about going back to school and he's thinking about majoring in psychology. And so I was like, hey, here's my business card. Like, send me an email if you want to talk more about becoming a psychology undergrad. Like, just random stuff like that. So I think that's another big one. I think another thing is to think of what your hobbies are. And if you don't have hobbies, like figure out some hobbies, try some out, and then going and seeing if there's clubs for those hobbies in the area. So book clubs, running clubs, CrossFit, walking in nature, anything along those lines, knitting clubs, book, whatever it is. Like figuring out what do you enjoy doing, and then figuring out whether or not there is, you know, organizations or clubs that do those things. And I think the last thing is to commit to hanging out in person. Again, putting the phones away, like going and having a game night, having people over for dinner, and like putting your phones away and like really connecting with people, I think are 4 practical ways that I talk about like how to, you know, really combat loneliness and feel connected to people.
Yeah, those are great ones, you know, not just one practice per se, but multiple little practices that we can all do. And I think that's a great start. And I love the hobbies part because it goes right back to my point earlier, because sometimes it's just, you're just not connected to yourself. You know, I think we can all connect to ourselves better. And hobbies change as well. Maybe you're picking up something new without knowing, or maybe it's time to reconnect to old hobbies that help. And I think that would help with all other kinds of interactions. I love the stranger talk that you were sharing. I was like smiling. What are the odds of someone walking to a psychologist saying they wanted to get into psychology without knowing that that's a psychologist?
Right.
That's
right.
Fun.
Yeah. I'm like, yeah, it's just so funny.
Yeah. Oh my. Yeah. That's really good to hear. Fun. Well, thank you for sharing that. And we are now at the end of this podcast episode. I would love to talk about this topic more, honestly. It's been really fun talking to you, but I know it's time to let you go. And before we do that, we've got open mic. So please feel free to share whatever you're passionate about with us. I know exactly what you're going to talk about. So I'm keen to hear more about it.
Yes. So I'm super excited. So I'm writing this parenting book and I absolutely love the name. So the name of the book is The Number 2 Parenting Book, Practical tips for the pooped out parent.
Love that. Love it.
And so the whole premise of the book is there's 29 practical tips, parenting tips throughout the book. And you can read each tip in the amount of time that it takes you to poop. So under 7 minutes. I gave a little bit extra leeway. So you're not supposed to poop longer than 5 minutes. Most people are supposed to poop under a minute, but I'll give you, up to 5 minutes. But it's a practical, like an actual real life story that has happened either to me or to a client or to a friend or whatever. And then it gives you, then after that, it kind of talks about how would you go about addressing the issue that was brought up in the story in very practical ways, like stuff that you could implement in the next 24 hours.
Love that. I mean, I'm not a parent yet, but I'm sure, all the parents out there or parents to be would love to read your book. When is it coming out?
It's December 29th as it will be launched, and it should be available on Amazon.
Oh, very cool. Thank you so much for sharing this. And in case this episode gets released, after the book has been launched, we're talking about December 2023. So it might already be ready by the time this episode is up. So yeah, we're excited to read your book and thank you for sharing that. Finally, if our audience would like to find out more about your work, where should they go?
They can go to Instagram and Twitter and TikTok. And it's Dr. Dre Mata, so DRDRE, and then MATA on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. I'm slowly getting more into TikTok. I was watching this YouTube video the other day on a comedic, like a comedy technique called Yes And. I was learning more about it. And in it, they were talking about like how the comedian was talking about how she just started like recording like 1-2 minute videos on TikTok every day and just kind of getting that practice in. And then if you are a LinkedIn person, it's Andrea Mata, PhD. Love connecting with people on LinkedIn as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I was just quickly Googling it. Found you. Very great content there, it seems. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your content. I'm excited to find out more about your book when it comes out as well. And as I said earlier, we might invite you back for another podcast episode exploring a whole other topic that doesn't get talked about very often. But yeah, it's been great having you here and thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.